Good morning, everyone. So let us all take 3 deep breaths to get ourselves fully in this place. So breathe in and out. And in and out. One more time. I thought I was supposed to do the welcome. Am I supposed to? Oh, okay. Good morning. I'm delighted to welcome you here to this special place. My name is Mike Owens. I use the pronouns he and him, and I have the delight of being your worship associate today, along with Robert Reynolds. Also participating in our service today is our pianist, Liz Raymond. We are grateful to our tech team, to Michael Morford, John Lehman, Jim Asparo, and Jim Kramer, who enable us to reach all of you at home. To our live stream host, Charles Batista, to our staff, Aaron Levantman, Mary Kreutz, and Douglas Kramer, to our greeters and welcomers, parking lot monitors, coffee makers, snack slicers, and anyone else and everyone else who helped to make this morning happen. We're going to continue with our opening hymn, Return Again, which is number 1011 in your teal hymnal. My mistake. It's number 188 in your gray hymnal. Please stand as you are willing and able. We will sing this through twice. It's Come, Come, Whoever You Are.
Brokenhearted by Kathleen McTeague. You who are brokenhearted, who woke today with the winds of despair whistling through your mind, come in. You are brave but wounded, limping through life and hurting with every step. Come in. You who are fearful, who live with shadows hovering over your shoulders, come in. This place is sanctuary, and it is for you. You who are filled with happiness, whose abundance overflows, come in. You who walk through your world with lightness and grace, who woke this morning with strength and hope, You who have everything to give, come in. This place is your calling, a riverbank to channel the sweet waters of your life, the place where you are called by the world's need. Here we offer in love. Here we receive in gratitude. Here we make a circle from the great gifts of breath, attention, and purpose. Come in.
Technical difficulties.
And
Our chalice lighting words come from Each of Us Brings by Penny Hackett Evans. Each of us brings a separate truth here. We bring the truth of our own life, our own story. We don't come as empty vessels, but as full people, each with our own story and our own truth. We seek to add to our truths and add to our stories. This room is rich with truth and rich with experience. All manner of people are here: needy, joyful, frightened, anxious, bored. We all bring our truths with us. May we all recognize the truth and the story in other lives than our own. May we hear May we hear and honor the truths that we all bring as we gather together. Together we have truths. Together we have a story. Together we are a community. All right, so our story for today is I don't have the story. I can't find it.
You're good at telling stories. Make one up.
No, let's just go to the hum.
All right.
All right.
the theme this month is attention. Well, in working right along with the rest of the service, there we go. Reverend Gail told me she might have an important message for us. So, she wants me to share a couple of words with you. April Fool. Well, that explains a lot. Okay, so what is this all about? Is it just an April Fool's joke? Yeah, pretty much. We can all go home now. No, of course not. There is meaning in the madness. At least we hope so. What is the point of all this nonsense? The wrong hymnal, no alcohol in the chalice, missing matches, phone calls, microphone failure. By the way, the tech team insists that I tell you Mike's mic did not fail. That was deliberate as well. Well, as I started to say earlier, this month's theme is attention. It takes the attention of a big team to make every Sunday work. It takes the attention of a team to make all those little things that went wrong today go right. It takes the attention of a team to make all the little things that went right today go right. And it takes your attention, all of our attention, to be present, to be here together, to flow through a service together. What if half of you were scrolling through your Instagram feed or showing your seatmate the latest grandkid pictures from Facebook? Can you imagine? You probably can't imagine. I've been in meetings like that. Well, anyhow, speaking of paying attention, did you notice all the things that went right? Some of you might be thinking, yeah, like what? Well, the doors are open, the lights are on, the chancel's beautiful, the temperature's nice, the music's great. There's coffee in the kitchen. The chalice is lit, finally. Mike's mic is working, and so is this one. The live stream is on. I could go on and on about all the little things that have gone right even today with all the things we scripted to go wrong. Also, the day is beautiful, and we are here together. We often don't see the good because basically it's wallpaper. We expect it. So we take it for granted. And as important as it is to pay attention to the things that are wrong, the things that could be better, the things that maybe we can improve, I think perhaps we can use a little more attention to the good. Now, this service is an anomaly. We deliberately made a few things go wrong. But that's not to say every service is perfect. Just ask any worship associate. The number of perfect services is exactly 0. There are none. Most of the imperfections go unnoticed because of a different kind of attention, flexibility. So, for example, a reading gets skipped. Well, is it critical to the message? Okay, we'll work it in as soon as we can. Is it maybe not so critical and the clock is ticking a little fast today? Okay, let it go. But to do that takes, well, to be usefully flexible, let's say, you have to know what's going on. You have to pay attention to what should be going on. You've got to know what resources you've got that you could quickly make use of to fix it. So it's just another form of attention and a mindset that lets us adapt in service and in other parts of this church to work together. So, sometimes, in spite of all of that, things go sideways. So what do we do? What do we do then? Do we just call off the rest of service? Well, you know we don't. You've been here. We work together, all of us, to adapt on the fly and keep moving. And what does that take? Well, of course, it takes attention, yes. And it takes flexibility, certainly. But it takes more. It takes generosity, compassion, forgiveness, to accept the imperfection and move on. So, What's that? Well, happily, we don't have to go around calling ourselves the congregation of attention, 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 flexibility, compassion, generosity, and forgiveness. Because there's a word for that, I think. That word is, well, what we need and what we are. What that is community. Oh, well. Each Sunday, we place 4 stones in our chalice to help us remember the future we're working for. The mountain-shaped stone prompts us to imagine a world where this place where we gather, called Tewa Ogapoge, meaning, sorry, this one's not scripted. There we go. Yeah, I know, but there's a lot of other words. Let's do that again. Called in Tewa Ogapoge, meaning white shell water place, is cared for joyfully by the descendants of its ancestral occupants, together with all those who have come to love it and dwell in it. The geode inspires us to imagine a world where peace is endemic, and war is a thing from the distant past, understood as an acute and deplorable failure of the imagination. The ancient fossil-studded stone helps us imagine a world thriving in the midst of climate change, a world where human participation contributes to a biosphere that is vibrant and diverse and deeply alive. The layered stone asks us to imagine that the vein of quartz that divides it actually holds it together. May it help us imagine a time when the differences between us are understood as boundaries that connect us. We honor these boundaries and our differences and use democratic processes to ensure that all of us thrive. These dreams of respect and peace, of a healthy planet, and a robust democracy become realities as we and other good-hearted people around the world work together to unravel racism, mend generational patterns of violence, fight for democracy, and learn to live peacefully and regeneratively on our planet. May we find joy and meaning in these struggles.
We set a time aside each Sunday to share our joys and our sorrows, with the understanding that joys shared are amplified and sorrows shared are easier to bear. Today we start with a deep appreciation to lovely Reverend Gail for always showing up to speak the truth to power. She is our hero, our North Star. We are blessed to be with her in conscious community. We have a warm welcome to our newest member, Jane Bleckman, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, who signed the book today from the membership committee. Catherine Salveson writes, I am humbly grateful for the outpouring of love to me at John Bishop's death. This beloved community engulfed me with cards, hugs, warm smiles, and love. John's passing was peaceful with all his children nearby. A joy from Natalie Wright, if I'm making sure I'm in, Natalie Wright, Curley, thank you, Natalie Wright Curley. So happy we had a successful, peaceful, and well-attended No Kings event yesterday. Estimated 8,500 people in Santa Fe showed up. Katie Yonda writes, love and prayers, please, for the family, friends, and community of Sarah Giorsi? I'm terrible with names. Especially her two children, Nico and Sadie. Sarah died this past week, so our hearts go out to her children. One of the joys of being a member of UU Santa Fe is that we get lots and lots of visitors. And according to the sheet I have here, I'm going to read your names, and if you feel brave, you may put your hand up so we recognize you. If you don't, that's fine. We'll still come and look for you after the service for coffee and refreshments. So we have Terry Nelson Curie from Omaha, Nebraska. John Schoen from Santa Fe. Am I pronouncing that right? Shane. John Shane from Santa Fe. And Patty Shane, it says Santa Fe and Maine. Ooh, cold up there. We have Keith from Santa Fe. Allie and Susan. Keith from Santa Fe, Allie from Monterey, California, and Susan from Santa Fe. Let's see, and birthdays. Something I'm glad they have this written because I would have forgotten. Birthdays this week. Please help celebrate or welcome Paul Zeisman, Jane King, Laura Lee Freelick, and Jim Vivian, who are celebrating birthdays this week. Happy birthday to all of you. And then finally, let us light one last candle for all the joys and sorrows that we carry with us that at this time are too personal to share. We continue with singing Spirit of Life, which is number 123 in the Gray Hymnal.
Staying with the spirit of that music, let's enter an attitude of quiet and meditation. This is So Good by Rosemary Watola Trummer. This morning, I slip out of my good bed into my good green slippers. I drink good coffee and play a good game of chase with my nephews. They are good, good boys. I take a good long drive with my good old friend, and we arrive in a town I have loved for years, full of good memories and good people. There, we eat a good dinner and then spend a night sharing poems. I'm grateful for the poems that make me ache, because it's good to bear what's bad together. It's not easy, but real good. The kind of good that makes your whole body hum, that makes your hands clap and your heart stretch wide, feeling so good, even as you cry. Staying with the mood of quiet, let's have a moment of silent meditation. Thank you, Lynn. Our reading comes from Barbara Kingsolver. In my own worst seasons, I've come back from the colorless world of despair by forcing myself to look hard for a long time at a single glorious thing, a flame of red geranium outside my bedroom window, and then another, my daughter in a yellow dress, and another, the perfect outline of a full dark sphere behind the crescent moon. Until I learned to be in love with my life again, like a stroke victim, retraining new parts of the brain to grasp lost skills, I have taught myself joy over and over again.
As our little comedy of errors at the beginning of the service showed, and as the continuation of errors here and there, what we might call unforced errors, it's easy to get caught up by what's going wrong and overlooking what's going right. It's easy to overlook and forget that creating and putting on a good service doesn't happen without the loving attention and effort of all of us. The same is true for creating and sustaining what is good, spiritually uplifting, and life-affirming at any scale of human activity: city, county, and state, nation, watershed, climatic zone and ecosystem, family, community, and culture. Things go right and good things happen because of the loving attention and effort to make them happen. This isn't easy. In fact, it can be damn difficult to give the kind of loving attention and effort to making things go right when being overwhelmed by all the things that are going wrong in our world. Bombardment, figuratively and literally, by conflict and war, poverty and famine, disease and environmental degradation, autocracy and crime, drains us of time, energy, and hope, until all we want to do is cower under our blankets and weep at the madness and the sadness of it all. To use a phrase popular among engineers, when you're up to your ass in alligators, it's hard to remember that your goal was to drain the swamp. In the face of evil, spiritual desecration, and the destruction of life, we have to find ways to sustain and nourish ourselves. The words of Barbara Kingsolver in our reading suggest one way to do this: by forcing ourselves to look hard for a long time at a single glorious thing, and then another and another, until we learn to love our lives again, until we remember joy and awe and wonder, until we remember all that is good and spiritually uplifting and life-affirming again, all that is worth fighting for to create and sustain. To nourish ourselves with the sounds of birdsong and the activity of bumblebees, the smile of the Mona Lisa, the rising notes of the Ode to Joy, the smell of a newborn baby, and the silvery softness of moonlight, the warmth of another's hand in ours, and the fun of playing a game with friends. To replenish ourselves so we can again face hate with kindness, desperation with giving, sickness with healing, and intolerance with a hug. Remember, too, that you are not alone. You are not some incarnation of the quintessential American myth of the lone hero, someone who can put right what is wrong all by your lonesome. Beyond the scale of our personal lives, the things going wrong in our world are too big for any one person to take on. We have to work together as a loving and caring community, combining our strengths and efforts, our knowledge and experience, and everything else that we bring. Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. did not work alone. Thousands upon thousands of other people, ordinary people just like you and me, worked and struggled and fought together to try and create the better world that Gandhi and King envisioned. That work and struggle continues to this day and will continue after we have become dusty history. Evil, spiritual desecration, and the destruction of life are persistent human troubles, bedeviling us from our long ago beginnings into our undiscovered future. Things going wrong in our world aren't arithmetic problems with tidy answers that, once solved, need no further attention. Our work to create and sustain what is good and spiritually uplifting and life-affirming has no end. Just as our ancestors had to struggle and fight to make things better, so do we, and so will our descendants. Peace is not eternal, nor freedom, nor a livable environment, nor enough to eat. They exist only so much as we give loving attention and effort to them. We will try and we will fail again and again. What matters is that we as a community help each other back up, dust ourselves off, and go back to work together this day and every day. May it be so. I am told at this point we have a testimony from Jim Bellamy in regards to the pledge campaign. Come on up.
Good morning, everyone. This is my first time up here. It looks very nice. All these friendly faces. I am a fairly new member of UU Santa Fe. My wife Joan and I joined last fall. I am also a member of the Stewardship Committee and a member of the Pledge team. So I'd like to update you on our current pledge campaign. But before that, I thought I might tell you a little story about how I became a UU, if it's okay with you folks. Okay. My story begins 9 years ago, in the spring of 2017. I'm 74 years old. And I characterize myself as a dyed-in-the-wool free thinker, determined to follow my own path, learning how to work things out for myself, and never really ever having any interest in being told what to believe. So none of the established churches with their prepackaged dogma appealed to me. I remained unchurched for my whole life. And that was okay, I managed. But there's something about being unchurched. There is a little something lacking. And it's what I would call a spiritual safety net. Others might call it spiritual underpinnings. I sensed over these unchurched years that I missed that, particularly in a potential time of crisis. And in the winter of 2017, back in Canada, I faced the greatest crisis of my life. It was a bitter winter. I was caring for an ailing wife who later died difficultly, and I had a tough time coping. I was full of despair, and I was missing that underpinning, that spiritual underpinning. I really felt it. I was having a tough time. I was alone in Canada, bitter winter, just with my dog, and I had a job to do. I had to get back to Mexico to take care of my winter home, which had stayed empty the whole winter. So I managed to get back to Mexico in the spring, and fortunately, I was greeted by a friend and neighbor. Her name was Joan Jagdish, and there she is. Now, Joan, her husband had passed 3 years prior, so she knew something about how to manage grief. And she helped me manage my grief. Boy, this is tough. And she set me back on a road, my life back on the road. But she did something else that was very significant. She suggested that I might like to visit her church. And she said, the church is called the Lake Chapella Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. I said, okay, I'll give it a try. So the next Sunday, Joan took me to church. And as I walked through the entrance into the courtyard, I was greeted by this very friendly welcome team, just like our welcome team here. And they gave me some background on Unitarian Universalist theology, and they pointed out that the theology was completely free of dogma. Dogma-free. It was like a eureka moment in my life. For the first time in my life, I think I found my church. A church that could accommodate an old free thinker like myself. So I jumped in feet first, enthusiastically. I signed the membership book. I pledged. I started attending Sunday services. I joined the board of directors. I became church treasurer. I was all in on this beautiful moment where I felt saved by this brand new church. Now, the story ends on a lovely note. A year after I joined the church, Joan and I got married in that very same church. And it was a wonderful ceremony. And it was, I believe, the first wedding ceremony in the history of the church. Now, we love our little Mexican church. It's, by the way, it's about half the size of this church. And we'll continue to support it. But here we are today, living in Santa Fe, members of this wonderful religious community, UU Santa Fe. And that's my story. Let's get on to business. I am pleased to report that this pledge campaign has an outstanding start. You early birds have just done us a wonderful, wonderful favor by being so generous with your pledges. We are at this very early stage. We have 46 pledges. We have got a pledge total of $145,000. That's 39% of our total pledge for the year. And what is most important is most of these early bird pledgers have pledged at least 10% more than they pledged last year. So we thank you, early birds, from the bottom of our heart. You are such a blessing. And obviously, we got to show the thermometer. And there it is. 40% gone, but 60% left to go. So we got a big job ahead of us. Now, when I mentioned that the early birds had, in the main, pledged at least 10% more than last year, that was a very, very important number, because our pledge campaign this year is asking that we get a total pledge, dollar pledge, that's 10% more than last year. And this is a pretty important number. I've looked at the draft budget for next year. There's no fat in that budget. We need that 10%. So that is going to be the rest of my pitch. And to provide a little more, I guess, support for the argument, let me talk briefly about our two major expense categories. The first expense category is staff, salaries, and benefits. This is by far the largest expense category we have. It represents about 70% of our total expense. And what can I say about our wonderful staff? When I first started coming here as a guest, I was amazed at how professional they were, how they carried out their duties, how dedicated they were. We are very, very lucky to have this wonderful staff. They deserve a raise, so let's give them one. That's expense category number one. Expense category number two is building maintenance. This building is beginning to show its age. And that means that maintenance costs are going to go up. They have to. Now, I was shocked to learn when Jim Kramer told me that in the past, we sometimes were unable to fully fund maintenance. We had to put off maintenance because the money wasn't there. What can I say? As a new member, that's shocking, absolutely shocking. So let's never again underfund the maintenance of this beautiful church. So that's my second point. There are many, many more. I could talk for a while, but I'll probably get I'll probably get the hook. There it is. I'm getting the hook already. So let me finish up. The 60% of our pledge yet to come. For those of you who are yet to pledge, number one, please pledge soon for two reasons. If you pledge in the next 2 weeks, you get to qualify for a $100 draw. But more importantly than the money factor, if you pledge within the next 2 weeks, you really give the budget team an opportunity to craft an accurate budget based on a projection of income flow. So please pledge soon, and if you can, please increase your pledge by at least 10% more than last year. I know you can do it. I know we can. The need is so great. Our mission is so important. If we all give generously, we're going to put this pledge campaign over the top. Thank you.
I believe we have someone from the Justice Council to come up and for the offering. Yep.
Good morning. Guy, what a joy to see so many of you at the rally yesterday. That was great. And we got to hear Reverend Gail's meaningful words. And I want to give a special thank you to Natalie Curley, who did most of the organizing for that rally. So thanks. So I'm Gail Wasserman, and I'm a member of the Social Justice Council. We've been incredibly active recently. Our congregation recently joined the Santa Fe Faith Coalition, which right now is primarily focusing on supporting immigrants here in the community. One of their main projects is to funnel money to immigrants in need through organizations such as Contigo, Las Cumbres, Somos un Pueblo Unido. I really think that by joining with other congregations in the city, we can have a larger impact on both our actions and our money. I'm really looking forward to teaming up with these like-minded individuals and finding ways that we can work together. Right now, UUSF, along with the Faith Coalition, are collecting items for Reading Quest, which offers free reading tutoring for kids reading below grade level, and Adelante, which supports students who are experiencing housing instability. So we have a barrel right outside the coat closet where you can place your donations. The items needed are listed on the barrel and in the weekly newsletter. And you can bring those items in until April 30th. They've kind of increased the time. It's almost time for this congregation to select the recipients for First Sunday Giving for the next fiscal year. Remember, once a month, we pass our basket for local organizations who are helping our community. Sometime in the next couple of weeks, look for sheets of paper on which you can nominate organizations for us to support. We will have our final vote during our all-congregation meeting on June 14th. Organizations should be small enough that our donations of a little less than $1,000 would make a difference to their budget. If you want to get involved in helping organize First Sunday Giving, I would see Katie Yonda, who's in charge of that. Once a month, our congregation is serving a hot lunch at the Salvation Army. We also put together hot lunches on holidays at the Pallet Homes. Barbara Pollard is our lead if you'd like to get involved. And I'll tell you, Reverend Gail has been instrumental in organizing other congregations in this city to also offer lunches on other days. We're helping really fill a void that was created by the closing of Pete's Place. The Advocacy and Democracy team, led by Gail Boyd, was so active during this legislative session, and it worked relentlessly to push through many bills. They're now taking a well-deserved deep breath and are planning their next steps, including how to support get out the vote efforts this fall and working on some national legislation. Tell you, on June 21st, we're going to be offering training on how to observe and record actions by ICE. I hope you'll be able to join us there. And if the state of the environment stirs your heart, we have an environment team led by Jean Darling, and you can talk to her. This week, I was reminded of one UU who stood up bravely to injustice. In 1965, after Martin Luther King called for people of all faiths to travel to Selma, Alabama, Viola Liuzzo, a white UU housewife, told her husband that she was going. She parceled out her 5 young children to friends and family and drove from Detroit to provide logistical support. She didn't have any specialized skills, but she was brave and willing to stand up for what was right. At the end of the march, she drove people from Montgomery back to Selma, and on one trip, there she was, a white woman alone in a car with a black man. For that infraction, she was shot to death by 4 Klansmen. The 61st anniversary of her death was just this last Wednesday. I think about her every year because she was an everyday person just like you and me. She wasn't a natural leader, no specialized organizing skills. When I think of her, she really motivates me to act righteously. Throughout history, UUs have stood up and taken action to ensure that all people are treated justly. You all are following in that tradition, and I hope you find some way to get involved in our justice activities here at UUSF. We will now pass the baskets to support all of the activities.
Our words to extinguish the chalice, our attention is both an act of resistance and an act of reverence by Reverend Michelle Collins from Soul Matters. Go forth from here with this blessing. May you see clearly without cynicism. May you witness pain without looking away. May you notice wonder even when despair makes more sense. Attention is both an act of resistance and an act of reverence. Choose it constantly, practice it daily, and come back when you need it renewed so you can choose it once again.
And now, because I don't have a microphone on, I'm going to have to just raise my voice. If you will all stand and join hands. May love and skill be in our hands. May love and skill be in our hands. May love and courage fill our hearts. May love and courage fill our hearts. May love and wisdom light our minds. May love and wisdom light our minds. May love flow through us and walk among us. May love flow through us and walk among us. As we live our lives and help to heal our world. As we live our lives and help to heal our world. Amen. Namaste. Shalom. Blessed be. Assalamu alaikum. Ashe. Aho. Please turn and greet your neighbors.
Thank you for joining us today, friends. We hope that you enjoyed today's service. Please take a little time and explore our website and visit our online welcome table if you'd like to know more about us. Otherwise, we'll see you next Sunday morning. Stay in touch and be well.